midi, tout le monde. We appreciate your e-participation in today's webinar in the face of the current COVID-19 situation, and hope everyone is staying safe and healthy. My name is Sachin Bhalla. I'm a communications officer with the Canadian Forest Service at Natural Resources Canada. Canada's Climate Change Adaptation Platform is pleased to facilitate today's webinar, Lessons from Wildfire Adaptation to Climate Change, or leçons tirées des mesures d'adaptation aux effets du changement climatique en matière de feu incontrôlé. We have two great speakers today. We have Dr. Dan Thompson, who has worked as a wildfire research scientist for the Canadian Forest Service since 2011, and as an adjunct professor at the University of Alberta's Department of Renewable Resources since 2013. His research is focused on boreal wildfire spread and the impact using an environmental physics framework. His interest is in the application of his research, and wildfire science overall extends to his training and designation as a nationally certified fire behavior analyst, where he provides numerical projections of fire behavior and spread to incident management teams from fire management agencies. His notable deployments include Fort McMurray in 2016, Kamloops, British Columbia in 2017, and Prince Albert National Park in 2018. He'll be presenting first, followed by Jeff Eustache, who graduated from the Nicola Valley Institute of Technology with a forestry diploma and Merit BC in 1990, and has been working in forestry ever since. He's also achieved a registered forest technologist accreditation with the Association of BC Forest Professionals, as well as an emergency management certificate with the Justice Institute of BC. He has managed Forest Field Management Department with FNESS for at least 5 years, and has been employed for the last 10 years. He works with the BC Wildlife Service, Ministry of Forest Lands and Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development, and the Union of BC Municipalities to deliver the Community Resilience Investment Program. And he also sits on CRI Management and the BC Fire Smart Committees. Dan, who will speak first, will provide an overview of wildfire management challenges and opportunities across every continent, and will provide a Canadian focus on emerging wildfire science and technology. Before I hand things over to Dan for the first presentation, I'd just like to note that we invite you to write your questions during the presentations in the space to the left, the little chat box there. Vous pouvez afficher vos questions en français et nous y répondrons pendant le webinaire. We will have a question and answer session after the second presentation, and the webinar will be recorded and will be available for viewing a day or two after the webinar, and we will share the URL by email. So, without further ado, I'd like to hand things over to Dan.
Thanks, Sachin, and I have control of the slides here. Settle slide. Here we go. Today I'll be talking about some of my own experiences, but mostly actually drawing on my larger organization and the larger wildfire management community overall. So that I give it a few wildfire people on the line, and I'm trying to provide sort of a general overview of some of the Canadian experiences internationally around adaptation. And this really draws on conversations I've had with lots of people over the years, and I don't pretend to have been to all of these places, but rather to represent a community that works myself from the science side with a bit of operational applications of science, but to acknowledge the hard work of the whole wildfire management community working at home and then internationally. So I'll just provide a little tiny slice of a perspective there that I can. So moving on here. Well, once again, I'm a wildfire research scientist with the Canadian Forest Service, and that's only actually one very small sliver of a much larger community. But the Canadian Forest Service, as part of the Government of Canada, has been, for almost 100 years now, been a national leader in wildfire science and the sort of applications of that science for managers. So currently we have 40 to 60, depending on how you want to count it, staff actively engaged in aspects wildfire research, and everything from back in the 20s and 40s of fire danger tables to sort of more sophisticated slide rule type things back in the 70s, and now sort of spatially distributed big giant risk models that we're able to run across landscapes. And you've seen our work. Anytime you've gone into a forest area or a national park, you've seen that fire danger dial from low to extreme, and there's actually a lot of science that goes into that fire danger dial. It might just seem like something that you just lick your finger and look at the wind, but actually this is something that has been sort of an ongoing evolution and an integral part of management. I'll be going back to the fire weather index over and over as it sort of relates internationally. And CFS, sort of the active government of Canada, therefore international representatives in the wildfire management community, in terms of some of the sort of policy and interaction spheres. So, we're involved across North America with the CEC, sort of the tripartite Canada-US-Mexico body around forest mapping, Arctic Council, North American Forestry Commission, UN Disaster Risk Reduction, carbon emissions, European Space Agency. So my organization has lots of toes and lots of little pools there, working on all sorts of projects that I'll mention through here as well with an international focus. And I did want to sort of contextualize, and you'll see these little maps come up through the rest of my talk here, that fire really is a global phenomenon and has really different environmental, ecological, which is sort of my sphere, but then also social context as well. Humans sometimes are not involved in fire in terms of, say, a lightning ignition in the northern boreal forest, but more often than not, humans are integral to that fire process. So we can see these maps here, the excellent satellite records that I'll talk about later, but now we have a really good idea of how fire as a process varies over the globe. And so we can see, Canada has, some of that red color and median fire size for some of the larger fires, and that top right value there, the FRP, that's megawatt, that's the intensity of the fire there. Once again, you can see lots of red in Canada and yellow. So we have some of the hottest fires in Canada, but we don't have a lot of fires. So that bottom little map there, you see actually shows a lot of dark blues, right? And so what we're seeing is, infrequent fire in Canada, but when it happens, it can be fairly large and some of the more intense fires across the whole planet. So I really just wanted to give folks a sort of overview of the different Canadian activities and Canadian interactions in some sort of hotspots of, if you will, fire across the world. And so what you can see here is Australia is an obvious one. And so, Australia, Canada's interaction with Australia is really a phenomenal, lending of resources, 239 total Canadian resources, mostly, almost exclusively from the Canadian Fire Management Agencies, so our friends in, Quebec and British Columbia and Ontario, and actually pretty much every wildfire management agency, spent some fraction of their Christmas holidays or some staff over in Australia lending a hand to their record fire season. And basically, that's the issue in Australia is their record fire season, that they keep on having record fire seasons. A mixture of human and lightning ignitions. Lightning ignitions happen in, 100 ignitions on the same day. And the big contrast from the Canadian experience that we'll talk about later is actually these are really lethal fires that we're talking about here, 33 fatalities. It's really a dramatic loss of life compared to the Canadian experience. In the Canadian perspective, as a Canadian fire scientist, we have really strong sort of collaborative bonds with, long-standing bonds with the Australians who have really such a separate ecosystem that they have their own sort of unique science ecosystem as well, and we interact with them a fair bit. And they have their own fire management, fire weather index system, and all those sorts of things. And it is a mutualistic relationship here. I worked with Australians in 2017 in British Columbia, and they came, I think, as 2018 as well. And Australia really does have that opposite seasonal southern hemisphere fire season, so it's an off-season sort of exchange of resources. And like I said in the title of my talk, I want to highlight sort of one known unknown. What do we know that our knowledge gap is here? And in the science and technology perspective for Australia, I think we're really at the point where we actually think that this is the new normal, but we're not sure whether the fire regime, the ecosystems really are moving sort of a one-way shift in Australia to something more flammable. And like I said, we have really good exchange, and that's part of the adaptation process is to provide that surge capacity back and forth. And in terms of societal adaptation to wildfire, what we're seeing here is a conversation in Australia that we're having with our Australian colleagues around sort of the risk sciences is, how do we harden communities? How do we evacuate communities before the fire is even there? Fire danger is so extreme to sort of pre-evacuate communities, if you will. And that's a level of adaptation that we haven't gone through in Canada yet. And also re-examining a volunteer-based fire response is another one. And so other sort of Commonwealth friends here in New Zealand, doesn't seem like as much of a wildfire-prone area. However, they had a sort of wake-up fire, if you will, in 2017 in Port Hills, just outside of Christchurch, which is the same town as their SCION, the Wildfire Research Group, based out of Christchurch. And it's a multiple hazard perspective here. Not climate change. It was a series of earthquakes in 2011 that they were profoundly affected, in 2015 sort of nearby impact. So they were dealing with multiple hazards and recovery, and then another natural hazard unrelated to climate change in terms of earthquakes. Our science and technology links with New Zealand are really strong. New Zealand uses the Canadian Fire Weather Index system for their public warnings and agency preparedness. Once again, very volunteer-driven, unlike Canada. They're a user of our Canadian-made Prometheus fire growth model that allows fire management agencies to sort of give these short projections of where a fire is going to be after ignition in a few days. And they have really, as Australia does, really profound unknowns in terms of fire spread in some of their invasive species, such as gorse, which is an invasive shrub that is highly flammable, and the science behind that is always evolving. There's new invasives and new ecosystems coming about from these invasive species. And part of their adaptation is, really changing their response from a sort of hourly, there's a grass fire that volunteers put it out, to these really profound wind-driven, drought-driven fires. And New Zealand's not used to very much drought. They're getting more and more of it. And also sort of staffing up to a professional force is a societal adaptation challenge, where, you can get a volunteer to respond for a few hours to put out a grass fire, but the technical training for, say, a Prometheus tool, and you're dealing with multi-day, what we might say, campaign fires, if you will, that it might require a 2-week shift is a hard thing for volunteers. So there's a lot of adaptation needs that are there. And moving on to Indonesia, sort of as we're going from the International Dateline West, moving sort of a survey of fire here. This is an area where the Canadian Forest Service has a fairly long and involved interaction with the Indonesian government, and we can see here just little snippets of the peak months of fire activity there in the little right map, with a lot of sort of August, September peak fire activity, and a societal result of these immense low energy smoldering tropical peatland fires is incredible impact on air quality across both whole islands of Sumatra and Borneo, into Singapore, sort of lots of international issues, cross-border air quality issues, and a lot of that from the experience of other CFS colleagues who worked there previously, they tell me has a lot to do with tropical peatland drainage, rice, palm oil. If you've ever heard about responsible palm oil, that has implications here. And what's happening is that when you have these human drain peatland systems that are tropical peat, you're actually burning off 20% of this organic deposit that has taken, remember, no glaciers there, hundreds of thousands of years to form a few meters of this tropical peat, and now it's all burning off due to human-caused drainage. So the Canadian Forest Service helped establish the Fire Weather Index system and other sort of information technologies with their Indonesian Bureau of Meteorology there back in the early 2000s, and continual follow-up. And these are really across Southeast Asia, profound impact on air quality. And so for adaptation in Indonesia, what I've been told by my colleagues that I've worked there, there's a lot to do with land tenure, land management, including simple things like just having good land tenure maps, the simple geographic information system, especially around parks and protected areas, incentivizing restoration. And really unknown here is, the science is really clear. You need to re-wet the peatlands during profound drought. We see more fires. There's not a lot of ambiguity there. What we really need there is the sort of social side of the staying power of those restoration efforts, funding, buy-in, government involvement. It can't just be outsiders doing this. You really need to incentivize local, responsible ecosystem management there. And so for Europe, moving over a little bit more to the north and west there, once again, sort of more like the Australian experience, more like California experience. What we're seeing there is fires with large fatalities. So July 2018, 108 people killed in a seaside town in coastal Greece there. Numbers that we have not experienced in Canada, in over 100 years in terms of fatalities and fires. There's quite an issue with ecosystem management in drought in Scandinavia, with accelerating fires from almost nothing to more and more fires, and smoke from large fires in Russia, and once again also sometimes in drained peatland agricultural systems. So the European Copernicus European Fire Information System does use the Canadian Fire Weather Index system, as you can see there in the little orange map, following precisely the system that we do in Canada. So that's a good application of Canadian science and technology. And some jurisdictions are once again using some of our fire growth models as well. And really the adaptation in the European sense is actually about, because fire with this sort of level of lethality and complexity is sort of new to the European experience, they're really building up science-based management. So the Pau Costa Foundation in sort of Portugal, or mostly Spain, but also Portugal, and the whole European Union is training up a number of sort of science-based fire managers with their Pyro Life initiative. And really, the unknown that I see, at least personally, is that how does wildfire fit in when you're managing multiple natural hazards, flood, extreme heat, which these are often happening, and there's societal pressures, and just the heat waves themselves are a profound sort of social focused natural disaster, and then you have fire on top of that, and of course here we all at home, pandemic, here it is as a once again natural hazard as well. So where does fire sit in that? How do you plan and prepare for those integrated preparedness actions? I think is sort of the emerging conversation that I've heard and talked with my European colleagues. And if we move south a little bit, South Africa, it's really, I wouldn't have any experience at all speaking to the rest of the African continent, so I'll just focus on South Africa, where CFS and the government of Canada has more experience and has sort of really ramped up their wildfire management in the last few years. And so South Africa, of course, has Mediterranean region in the Cape Town area that has a fire ecology and a general ecology very similar to California, as well as Greece and Portugal and Spain. So, lots of wind-driven fires and shrubs, move very rapidly, people living in the area, lots of structure loss, really, really rapid sort of fires that last a day or two. There is also climate change in invasive species. However, with this climate change, given how dry it is in South Africa, there are questions about will it get so dry that the vegetation that grows back after fire will be, even smaller and have less mass to it, so that the fires, can't be as intense as it just turn into a desert. And what we see on the South African side here is just really in the last couple of years, the last decade or so, they've really worked hard to modernize their fire management and response capacity to the level that we see, in Australia, New Zealand, Europe. So you see that big yellow wildfire engine there that's able to sort of work off-road, modern helicopter response, weather forecasting, and a lot of this is through that yellow that you see there in the truck and the yellow uniforms that you see there are the Working on Fire initiative, which is sort of a mostly government and has some industry involvement, and it's as much an employment scheme and training scheme as it is a wildfire management and response. And had some great conversations. The manager there was at our recent wildfire conference, and you see they're just as proud about the social advance that they make by employing these firefighters and training them as they are in actually putting the fires out. So echoes of the New Deal sort of employment conservation corps sort of interesting adaptation there, where they're meeting sort of social needs for employment and skills training, also with environmental management needs. And our CAN, on behalf of the larger government of Canada, holds an agreement for resource exchange, and so we've seen South African firefighters come in 2016 with a few hiccups, but a really successful deployment in 2019 in northern Alberta. And I think the lower one there is some of the Canadian embassy staff greeting the wildland firefighters back upon their successful return from Alberta to South Africa, and really that surge capacity during Alberta's really needy wildfire season was welcome from South Africa there. And so moving on to South America, once again in an area that has limited natural fires, not an area with a profound sort of natural wildfire regime like North America, but once again you're seeing more of emergence of sort of once again Mediterranean wind-driven coastal fires. So Santa Olga in Chile, 2017, 1,000 homes destroyed, primarily lower-income residents, and 6 dead. And one of our big sort of science and technology questions is, are we going to see more of this windiness, the Santa Ana type winds that they have in California? Are we going to see more of them under this climate change? And of course, what does that mean for Amazonia under climate change, where you have land clearing and sort of drier conditions? And that was a sort of big topic in the news, of course, earlier in, I think it was sort of, over Christmas in that area. A lot of questions about Amazonia through the fall of 2019 as well, and land clearing, and, politics around that, and sort of drought sort of accelerating that process there. And so on the science and technology perspective, there's only so much you can do. We can monitor deforestation and monitor fire activity, and make really strong and profound and obvious statistical links between them that support measures on the ground in terms of compliance and sort of land management. Can't do much to promote compliance from space alone. And I think for the more coastal systems that are a little bit closer to some of what we're used to in terms of Mediterranean ecosystem fire management, what we see here in that big photograph there is in some of the sort of drier parts of Costa Rica. We have some Canadian wildfire scientists in Environment Canada and embassy staff doing some of the first training for the Canadian Fire Danger Rating System, Fire Weather Index System, to Costa Rican staff for some of the sort of grassland habitats where we can translate some of our learning into sort of wildfire management for the Costa Ricans. And one gentleman there in the white shirt standing in the background, and I think I can actually point him here. I think you can, maybe you can't see my, there we go. That's Rich Verbitsky, who is, one of our, Spanish-speaking staff in the Canadian Forest Service in the international side there. So, we have some capacity to do some really good communication and early education and outreach and translation of materials to wildfire managers. And, not in Costa Rica, but rather in Mexico, we similarly have a mutual aid and response mechanism to work within Mexico as well. So we've seen 3 years in a row having Mexican firefighters come up to Canada to help on our Victorial fires in British Columbia. But we have yet to deploy Canadian resources down to Mexico, and in my recent memory, at least, nor places like Chile or Costa Rica just yet. And sort of second to last here, we have in our survey our friends to the south in the United States. And what we see there is just sort of broad trends of most of the wildfire in the U.S. is sort of seen west of the Mississippi, primarily not in the Pacific Northwest, so sort of the California to Colorado, down to New Mexico, up to Montana, sort of belt to there is where you have most of the wildfire activity. And really the issue there is they coined the term wildland-urban interface. So people moving to be closer to the country, living with sagebrush in their backyard or bigger trees in their backyard, and basically putting their home structure at risk to wildfire loss. And the real challenge in the U.S. is that they'll have grass fires, in Texas and Oklahoma in the middle of winter, and they'll have wildfires, in the earliest spring in Georgia and Florida, and in the fall in California, and all summer long in Montana. But really, there's no quiet season in the U.S. And really, they're one of the top leaders in the world in terms of wildfire science technology, with a real focus on grass and sort of tall timbers. So, where the trees don't themselves, burn, but rather only the grassy understory is on fire. It's a different paradigm than our Canadian sort of crown fires where we see the whole tree light up. And really they're world leaders in things like satellite monitoring, using weather radar to help inform wildfire management, airborne monitoring, really sort of mature, profound leadership globally over this. But really actually a whole different system. So the National Fire Danger Rating System, it uses in the U.S. different numbers. It's primarily distributed as an empirical, so either they're talking about chains per hour for fire spread rather than, kilometers per hour or meters per hour. So, we don't really have a lot of scientific technology at the operational level that moves back and forth because we actually sort of speak different languages. That's a real challenge. However, there's a really profound amount of resource exchange, and our American neighbors are really the first to call for outside resources from Canada. And you can see all these little color schemes here as we go, all the way from Alaska down to Idaho or Manitoba, all the way down to we're down to Michigan. We have these compacts of sort of rapid exchange of firefighting resources where they can call across borders really easily, and the government of Canada, through Border Services Agency, can help expedite a whole busload full of firefighters from Michigan up to Manitoba really rapidly, and those are pre-existing agreements that are sort of held across borders for sort of rapid exchange, which is really a big part of that adaptation and surge capacity under climate change. The biggest issue that I see, at least, and talking to my American colleagues, is more of a social side there, where the really wildfire-prone areas are actually so expensive to insure a house that really you're actually excluding the whole sort of lower two-thirds of society's income bracket, where it's really too expensive to hold any insurance on a home system these days in places like California, where only people that can afford essentially to be uninsured are able to maintain home insurance there. And they have really, as you can imagine, a bit of an alphabet soup of state and provincial agencies, and for historical reasons, land tenure there is very patchy. There's a lot of multi-jurisdictional issues there as well. And lastly, to Canada, this could be its own, really giant discussion, and I'd invite anyone who really wants to have that discussion later to get myself or others on the phone, especially as we're all back at home here. Canada has lots of strategies, to deal with climate change, but and wildfire. But I'll zoom in here a little bit. The issue in Canada, despite Fort McMurray still sort of looming large in our minds and sort of as something that dominated media for many months in 2016, really large-scale home losses are actually rather rare in Canada. We don't see 1,000 homes lost in every large fire in Canada. It's pretty rare compared to the larger social impact and business interruption around evacuation. So whether that business interruption is around, say, Williams, like British Columbia, and sort of summer tourism and evacuation, or whether it's, really remote Indigenous communities that have either no road in or one road in, you're seeing social and business interruption there that has really sort of profound impacts on those communities. And Jeff will do a great job speaking to that later, so I'll be quick here. But our science and technology, we have over 100 years, so we have a pretty good idea of where the fires happen, how big, how large, what the timing is. Really none of this fire behavior that we see is not surprising. It might be shocking how big the fires get, but the fires rarely, break the laws of physics. We sort of understand, if it's that hot, and that dry, and that windy, there's every likelihood that the fire will get that big. And as we saw, in British Columbia, or even sort of under the radar in Alberta in 2019, given the right conditions, these fires can get really big. And what we're surprised continuously is how dry and how long it can be, say, between rainfall. And so really the hardest thing there is, if the whole country is dry, how do we optimize resources? Quebec wants to keep resources because it's sort of dry there, but they also, British Columbia might need them. So there's a lot of challenges there around resource sharing, which is a very active process in Canada amongst the wildfire management agencies. And the other sort of adaptation challenge here that I see is, as a Indonesia had two massive record-breaking back-to-back fire seasons, and then 2019 is really quiet. And that's totally to be expected in what we understand about, climate variability and year-to-year rainfall and year-to-year burned area. But how as a society you cope with two sort of, provincial states of emergency, everything's chaos, it drives the media narrative, and then it's ultra quiet. And how do we deal with that in terms of keeping that conversation going? Because we know that there'll be other big years, but if it's not every year, then it falls off the radar for people in planning and preparedness, sort of social preparedness for that climate change. So to me, that's the adaptation challenge there overall, is to keep that conversation going without people becoming, say, nihilistic or, just saying, oh, no, before in the past I would have said, no, we'll catch every fire, it's not a big deal, Smokey the Bear, and now we're moving beyond that. How do we sort of thread the needle of that conversation, between, not letting people be too nihilistic, but optimistic and feel like they're able to do those preparedness actions beforehand. So the real key message, and I put this picture that I took in Fort McMurray on purpose there, what does success look like? Success looks like, the fire that you weren't able to stop, and that's okay. Success looks like melted siding, maybe this is a bit brutal, but success, in a way, looks like melted siding on the side of your house. Your home is intact. Yeah, they couldn't stop the fire, but they're able to save the structure. Yes, you're going to be dealing with the burned forest and the aesthetic and natural impacts of that around your community. But if we're able to evacuate people safely and quickly, minimize that evacuation impact to business and to society, and bring people back to a home that evaded the fire overall, that sort of looks like success in a profoundly large fires under a climate change scenario here. So, there are as many social questions and policy as there are. The science problems are, I think, more solvable. Like, give us the money, we'll launch a new satellite, to help monitor these fires. Let us keep up the information systems. Those are more tractable than the social problems and a physical science. So I acknowledge these issues. And at the end of the day, once a fire gets to a certain size, there's only really limited suppression actions you can take. And Jeff's going to talk, I think, a lot about, what we can do around communities to mitigate. But, once a fire is really, really big and you're surrounded by really old forests, then there's only so much we can do. And that fire is going to run at you. We can't just, throw more water bombers at this problem. And there are always natural additions. So, prevention will only get you so far, right? And really, in an international perspective, sort of under the radar there's a lot of work that goes on in the winter with the wildfire management agencies and at the government of Canada internationally, keeping up the agreements, checking in with each other, updating things so that when you pull the trigger, you can bring in those resources internationally from the U.S. or even from Australia, from Africa, Mexico, to really make that rapid exchange of resources to meet that surge capacity. And that's really an important part of that sort of response side of adaptation sort of moving forward. So at that point, I'm a few minutes over. Thanks for my whirlwind tour there, and we'll save the questions till the end. Thanks.
First Nations Emergency Services Society. Thanks to the Canadian Wildfire Service and Natural Resources Canada for the opportunity to speak on this topic. I'm just going to give a brief overview of who Finesse is and some of the operations that we do through our Forest Bureau Management Department in Kamloops, and I'll be more specific on one of our pilots around prescribed burn program. So just a brief overview, and then I'll concentrate a little bit more on the details around the First Nations Adapt in relation to a pilot burn project we did last year in Indigenous Service Canada funding and partnership with BC Wildfire Service. So Finesse is a non-profit society. We are registered as a charity. We're governed by First Nations Board of Directors, elected by its membership. All the board directors are First Nations in the province of BC. Finesse operates only in the province of BC, and we're one of the only First Nations organizations across Canada that offer these type of services that I'm aware of. So basically, we want to provide a safe environment for First Nations communities that we serve in BC, through including awareness, training, education around emergency management, structural fire services, and forest fuel management department to work with government and other agencies to ensure that we access appropriate resources and promote healthier, safe communities, primarily in regards to flooding and wildfire. We do offer some critical incident stress counseling to an agreement with the First Nations Health Authority, but those are our primary areas that we work with at Finesse. So our Forest Fuel Management Department, we're primarily funded through the Strategic Wildfire Prevention Initiative that is now transitioning into the Community Resilience Investment Program. The Forest Fuel Management Department has been around since at least 2005. Once we started losing the battle with the Mountain Pine Beetle Initiative, there was an incredible amount of provincial and federal funding being put into BC and across Canada around Mountain Pine Beetle. And then it transitioned into the forest fuel management area as that became the risk due to the beetle impacts. So that's how our program at CAMPS was developed through a MOU with the Union BC municipalities and the province of BC through the BC Wildfire Service. And up to, I believe it was about 2010, Natural Resources Canada used to offer wildfire mitigation, forest fuel management dollars, and that ended. We picked that up about 4 years ago through direct agreement with Indigenous Service Canada. So now we support BC with wildfire prevention and mitigation program funding. So we support the communities to access the resources for these initiatives. We help them navigate through the funding applications and program criteria. So that's our primary service with our office that is based in CAMPS. And that is now what we do with the Community Resilience Investment Program. So we primarily work with provincial and federal government and agencies in regards to mitigation programs, which I might add in BC has been quite good. Going back from what I can recall, 2005, there's been a tremendous amount of resources put into the program. We also work with the province in regards to prescribed burning initiative and wildland firefighting response training and contract deployment opportunities. So we have a couple agreements with the province of BC in those two areas. So the First Nations Adapt program was a federal funding that we accessed for about 2 years now. It was a multi-year program. And basically what we wanted to do is we wanted to, how can we revitalize traditional burning information, knowledge, and integrate those values into wildfire management processes and contemporary planning and initiatives in today's world. Just to comment a bit more on that, going back to 2003, the province has undergone significant challenges due to wildfire across the province, and 2017 and 18 were quite big years for the province, and the two communities, Wheaston and Unisatine, have both experienced those impacts to their community. So due to these significant fires, specifically the 2017, the province commissioned the Adaptation report based on the wildfires and floods that impacted the province. And then over a year ago, they followed that up with a BC government action plan and strategy to implement the recommendations based on that Adaptation report. Some of the high recommendations were around Indigenous knowledge and inclusion into various mitigation and prevention programs. And one of those big ticket items was prescribed burning. How do we revitalize prescribed burning and incorporate some Indigenous knowledge into that, as well as the wildland firefighting to support local communities' knowledge into the provincial program. So it's quite timely, as we're all aware. First Nations communities across Canada and probably worldwide have utilized prescribed burning practices for many centuries, and it was to stop deleterious practices. Management philosophies, and now we're seeing the urge to revitalize and really look at that knowledge a little closer. So it's a high recommendation from the province to incorporate that knowledge, and how can we build that capacity back up into the communities. So that was the basis of this project. How can we gather the knowledge from the Indigenous perspective and blend it into today's contemporary planning and practices. So our three pilots was the Wheaston First Nation out of Bridge River, part of the Statley Nation, the Shacklet Indian Band out of the Merrick region, part of the Makaplamac Nation, and the Unisatine up in the Caribou, part of the Chilcotin Nation. So those were our three pilots. So how we went about that, we went through some qualitative interviews and analysis with knowledge keepers and elders within those three communities. We commissioned people that had the expertise to go into the communities and hold face-to-face interviews and questions, and videotape and recorded the information from the knowledge keepers, and then we synthesized and summarized that into our prescribed burning plan document and prescriptions, and we utilized the contemporary burn plan template to incorporate both knowledge sets. So it was a good case study to really look at historic practices and what were the important values and objectives from the Indigenous perspective into contemporary planning. So we went out and met with the communities, Wheaston and our contractors went out face-to-face just a kick-off meeting that discussed the objectives and the resources, requirements, timelines, and just a face-to-face to explain how the program was going to go through and ensure we addressed the right topics, and went through some sensitivity type stuff and protocols and those kind of things right from the start, and then identified the key community representatives who would participate, and also solicited the interviewees from the communities. And this is a meeting with the Shacklet Indian Band conducting the same, and on the right, the Timuc Research Group conducted the interviews and for both of those two communities. Actually, they did the Shacklet and the Unisatine, and Bridge River was done internally from our end. So looking at that knowledge set, and again, just trying to find what were some of the main primary values from an Indigenous perspective, and what were some of those values for historic burning practice. And some of the ideas were air inclusive, air range improvements, community protection, access, medicinal or increased vegetation within an area, open up access for wildlife hunting, those types of things. So we found most of the information was fairly similar from those three field, and we combine the two knowledge sets into one objective for a burn plan. Just a case, the area province of BC, you can see Kamloops is the bigger region, and Queenston, Bridge River, and Shakin are both within 2 hours of Kamloops, BC. Unisatina is further north up in the Chilcoot. I would say about an hour and a half west of Williams Lake, BC. So they're all in a fairly dry climate area of the province of BC, significant wildfire history impacts. I would say Queenston and Unisatina have undergone severe wildfire risk and impacts in the last, probably going back to 2003. I think in Unisatina and the Lowit region, there's probably only one really big green corridor left in the region. Especially in Unisatina, they've been impacted by the wildfires for the last 10 years. The question is, when was the last time they weren't impacted? So yeah, they've all faced their impact through the wildfires over the years. So the Westerners known as the Smiling People. They're part of a Stafford Nation, the Lowit Tribal Council, 9 kilometers northwest of Lowit, at the confluence of Bridge and Fraser Rivers, along Highway 40. So they have 3 reserves and 4,000 hectares. Small community, 464 registered band members, 200 living on reserve. The Shakin band is even smaller community. They're people of the Creeks. They're part of the Statler or McAlpin Nation of the Nicola Tribal Council. 40 kilometers west of Merritt, 20 kilometers east of Spencer's Bridge. Very small, remote community. It's very dry. They have a fair amount of hectares, but the registered band numbers is quite low. In the Unisatina communities, aka Stone or Stony, they're one of the 6 Chilcoot Nation communities. They just west of Williams Lake. Again, a fairly remote rural area. Smaller population, now 460 registered members. This is one of the burn plan maps that we developed for the community. Out of the 3 pilots, 2 of them went ahead to an actual burn, and that was Shakin and Weston. But we did complete the information for the Unisatina. So we have significant impacts to the mountain pine beetle, other forest health issues. They're fairly dry, open sites, sagebrush, pine grass, probably ponderosa and Douglas fir in the wetter areas. A lot of drought, so it really has increased the wildfire risk in those 3 areas. Shakin has not been as severely impacted as the other 2 to this day. They've had some close calls with their site that's dry and remote. Yeah, they haven't been quite as impacted. Field types again, ponderosa pine, Douglas fir. Shakin is a little drier with more sagebrush, and you can see the ponderosa and up in the hillsides, fairly open. Just a couple examples of some of the field treatments that Dan mentioned. A lot of the programs in BC are funding field mitigation programs, primarily thinning, pruning, plow and burn to open up the stand and the understory. A lot of burning practices on not as much mechanical in some of these regions due to the slope. Clearing is quite steep in the Bridge River area, and sometimes that comes with a higher cost. But Bridge River, the Western band, has been fairly aggressive in this program, and they've completed quite a few fuel treatments in the surrounding area of their reserve lands. They also, Fire Smart Community recognized community going back to 2014 as part of the Fire Smart Community recognition with Partners in Protection. So we actively participate in that program, and it's a volunteer type initiative that they've been pretty progressive with as well. This is some photos of the burn. So there's two phases to this project. We did the pilot that developed the burn plan, and then we accessed some funding to the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers, Natural Resources Canada, last year to develop a video on a prescribed burn. So we worked with the communities and the BC Wildfire Service to support the implementation of the burn plan. We received funds to help support the cost for the communities, conducting a little more interviews, and we had a videographer come in and they videotaped some more interviews in the actual burn. You can see the drone on the right. So it was a bit of some lessons learned when you're trying to tie in a video production and schedules around that. That was a bit challenging. We tried to do that within the last week of last March, and we got a cold front come in the weekend, kind of delayed it by a day or two, and then when it did kind of dry out a bit, it dried out too much for the west, and I think they got in 2 days and the wind picked up too fast, so we had to cut that short. But you can see the practices for many communities. It starts right on the doorstep and goes out to the communities. You can see in the background most of these sites were fuel treated through thinning and pruning. This is a copy of the burn plan map that was done for the community. You can see that all the assets and structures around the main village, and where we started the burn was right in the Wildland urban interface. Got a few interviews I want to put through from some of the knowledge keepers on some of their objectives of prescribed burning.
It's getting there. Sorry, everyone. It's buffering. Just give us 1 second here.
But the Apple Spring, we used to go up there and hunt annually. And up at the same places that our people used to go up there in springtime and burn the mountain to allow us to keep going up there to hunt. Because if it became too forested, wouldn't be as good utilizing that mountain as a hunting area. So we kept on going up there to burn them. And it was a spring job. You got to get up there before it dries up too much. It's probably the same with all our areas where we picked our raspberries and blueberries and huckleberries. Go in those areas, burn them down, and let them regrow.
sure we'll have enough time, but this is an actual clip of the burn occurring. Again, this was a partnership with the community and the BC Wildfire Service. Many of the members that were from the First Nation work for the province on BC Wildfire unit crews, so a few of the people on site will be going. They probably went back to BC Wildfire the following week to get ready for the season. You can see the winds are starting to pick up, but I think on the second day they had to shut it down. That team came up too much. So we did a couple infographs, the messaging and communications media that we copied. It's pretty common back east, and this just gives an overview of some of the summaries from our interviews, and all this information is on our website, so I'll just kind of skim through this one and go to the next slide. The Shack and Indian Band, similarly, they had Fire Smart Community Recognition. They respond to fires, grass fires, and they have a volunteer fire department. The different site that was burned, high-end sagebrush. You can see the difference in the fuel type. This is their burn plan map. They wanted to start on the edge of the community that's going into the community, would be on the west side there, starting from the river going up. I think this clip is quite interesting. It kind of speaks to the top.
Just over the past few years, I've noticed that a lot of the seasons are starting to overlap. We're getting hotter summers, colder winters, but the mishmash in between those seasons is the mix. Because we go from high waters flooding to drought conditions in like 4 weeks. And because it runs off so quickly, there's not enough time for the ground to absorb the water, which creates drier conditions for fires to start. And if we're able to properly introduce traditional burning into our practices again, I think it would help a lot with like forest sustainability and some of our traditional practices like berry picking and even hunting, and probably pest control. Like ticks seem to come in waves, and then one year it's just absolutely terrible. A fire goes through and then there's very little ticks.
So that's exactly what happened in 2017. Flooding, May, June, and July, the province blew up and everything was on fire. This is one of the ones from the Shack and Band. A lot of ranching in this region, same with the Choco team. A lot of uses of horses. And this is one of the ladies from the Unisa team community. Sorry about the audio. So another infograph for all. We have one for all 3 communities. So basically, we want to incorporate information from an Indigenous perspective into contemporary planning and increase and revitalize the practice for the communities and the province, and develop training and support in regards to prescriptions, burn plans, and burn implementation with the communities and the province and other agencies.
Jeff, are you okay if we maybe share the link to your video?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, we kind of run out of time. We have 2 videos on our website. They are really good. You see, if you look at nest.bc.ca, if you look into the tab Forest Fuel Management Department, you'll see the various initiatives that we work with in the videos, and with the graphs, you'll see a couple of questions regards to gold. Well, thanks. Thanks, Jeff.
Sachin, are you there?
Hi, yes, I am, and thank you very much. Those are really, really informative presentations, so we appreciate them, and the broad presentation in the topic demonstrated that there is significant interest. Also, I want to thank the participants for joining. We hope that the presentations proved useful in your adaptation work. I don't know if we have time for questions. I'm going to ask that to Annette. We already have gone over it, but there were quite a few. We can follow up the webinar. We will email. We've saved the remaining questions, and the presenters have offered to answer them by email in the near future. And the links will be shared. But we can get to the first question right now.
We
Is
can't.
that all right with him?
We are a bit over time, but maybe we can take maybe 1 or 2 questions while people are on the line, and then for the other ones, we have note of them. We know who asked them, and if it's okay with everyone, we can ask the presenters to follow up via email, if that's okay with everybody. But maybe if people want to stay on the line for a few more minutes, 1 or 2 questions maybe.
Yeah, all right. Well, the first question came in from Wade. It was COVID-19 will overlap with wildfire season. What are the implications? And I'm looking to address to Dan.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, just with the caveat that I don't speak on behalf of the Canadian Forest Service. Like, we're a science organization that works, with the folks like BC Wildfire Service. So I wouldn't be able to say, because that's not my cup of tea is sitting in front of a computer and making maps where the fires go and some of the sort of science international stuff around that. But I think that's a really good question. Maybe the one thing I can say is there is as Jeff showed there's a lot of on the ground work to make fires really go out. So the science around detection would tell you that air tankers and helicopters alone don't put a fire out. It takes people on the ground. And I'll leave it to the public people and the safety officers after that. I think it's an ongoing challenge, but the science tells us definitively that, you need people on the ground to put a fire out there.
Yeah, and you mentioned the integrated emergency plan during your presentation, I believe, and that's probably something that we look into and hopefully in the near future.
Yeah, and really quickly on that, the way we organize ourselves to respond to a wildfire is actually an all hazards case. So, communities preparing for wildfire response, and even at a community level evacuation stage, that's really preparing you for all situations. Fire is one of those hazards that can come
collaboration that BFS has on the social and cultural aspect of wildfire adaptation, especially with Indigenous communities in Canada and worldwide?
I really can't say personally, but I know we've been doing, this was fairly new for us last year to start gathering some of that information. There is a fair amount of information out there with the communities, but I understand that sometimes it's difficult to access that type of information due to confidentiality and those kind of things. We did participate in a blueprint for the Canadian wildfire strategy last year. We made some comments in that regard. Yeah, it's really hard to say, but the resourcing and information, I think it's out there. It's just a matter of who has it and access to this.